Alright, so I might absolutely go crazy by the end of this video because I filmed this once and realized my mic wasn't on. So we have a silent video. So here we are, part 2. Hopefully this goes better this time. Ugh, I'm a mess. You can tell I haven't made a video in quite some time because who forgets to turn on their microphone? Alright, so today we're going to be talking about the different types of feeder creatures for your reptiles. I am not a 100% expert. This is all from my personal research and experience, but this is what I've come to find, and hopefully this is of some help to you. And if you guys want to learn more about feeder insects and feeder creatures, then keep on watching. Okay, so the different types of feeder animals slash creatures I'm going to be talking about today are fruit flies, dubia roaches, crickets, hornworms, waxworms. Did I mention fruit flies? I already forgot. Fruit flies, if I didn't mention that already. Mealworms, superworms, and frozen mice slash rats. So there are others that are less common. I'm not going to be talking about them in this video just because I don't have a whole lot of personal experience with them. I don't know a whole super lot about them. So the ones that you could also be feeding your creatures are like butterworms, silkworms, redworms, and earthworms. Also referred to as like night crawlers. I do use night crawlers for my axolotl, so I know a little bit about them in that regard, but I don't have like turtles or anything, so I don't use those that often, so I'm not going to talk about that in this video. I do apologize. So there are some main components to these different creatures that you need to keep in mind when picking out feeders for your little reptiles. And the first one is moisture. This has to do with obviously like the water content in the insect and the hydration that it provides for your reptile. The next one is protein. This has to do with muscle development. This has to do with organ function. It provides energy to your reptile. And if you do have a sick reptile, this is going to be really great for cell regrowth and cell repair. That's really good for that as well. Next we have fat. This is going to be super high in energy, and it does have some benefits. However, you obviously don't want to give your reptiles insects with too much fat content because you don't want them to get obese. That'll lead to a whole slew of health problems, and that ain't good. We don't want any part of that. I'd say the perks and the benefits of having some insects with fat would be, it helps cushion organs and it helps insulate their body heat. It does provide energy, and it also helps absorb different types of vitamins like vitamin A, E, D, and K. It's also really good for creating fat storage for egg laying if you plan to breed, or if you have a female reptile, it'll be really good for that. But yeah, you want to refrain from too much fatty food because you don't want obese reptiles. That's no bueno. Alright, so next we have fiber. And this is very important for reptiles because it helps them to digest and pass the things that they eat. A lot of that fiber comes from the chitin in insects, and that is kind of like the exoskeleton on the bugs that you feed. A lot of times feeder insects don't contain a lot of fiber, but it is important for your reptiles, so by the time you give them a good amount of bugs, they will be good. Ash is kind of everything else. That is going to be all of the salts, the minerals, the metals that are contained, and also all of the guts and the insides. That is going to also be considered ash. And then lastly, we need to talk about the calcium to phosphorus ratio. Ideally, you want it to be a 2-to-1 ratio, calcium being the higher part of that, because you need to be able to break down phosphorus with the calcium, and it would be really bad if you had just way too much phosphorus in your reptile. So you want to make sure they can digest it. So you need higher levels of calcium. So first I'm going to talk about dubia roaches. So these are really great for gut loading. You can feed them a lot of everything really, and they absorb lots of nutrients, and they're just really good to feed for your reptiles. They're quiet, they don't stink, they can't climb up the sides of any bins or containers you keep them in, so that's really cool. Really like them for that reason. And I have come to find that as far as like breeding them goes, it's pretty simple. The only thing that sucks about them, I guess it's a good thing and a bad thing. It takes about 7 months for them to reach sexual maturity, and then a little bit longer for them to breed. And yeah, that takes a long time, but the nice thing is they have really long lifespans. Like, they can live up to a year to like a year and a half, which is really cool. If you don't want to breed them, or let's say you want to get started, they are a little bit expensive and they're a little scarce. They're not as easily obtainable, and I think it's just I don't know, they're not super popular yet, and they take a long time to breed, so maybe that has something to do with it. The only thing I will say that seems to be very successful for me as far as breeding them goes is make sure you keep a heating pad on the bottom of the container you keep them in. That seems to work really well. Keep them in egg crates so they'll breed and feel like they have some privacy and they can sleep in there. And also, if you want to give them some food, oranges work well. I don't keep them in there all the time just because they're high in acidity. You could use dog food, fish flakes, grains, potatoes. Potatoes I probably use more than anything else because they last a long time. So yeah, I would definitely say they're a good one to breed for your reptiles, and they are a really great source of food. So as far as their moisture goes, I would say it's about 66%. Their protein is 23%, fat is 7%, fiber is 3%, ash is 1%, and then the calcium to phosphorus ratio is 1:3, so it's actually pretty good. So as long as you coat them in some calcium before feeding, you should be good to go. Next, I'm going to talk about crickets, and as you all probably know if you are in the reptile community or you have reptiles of your own, these are probably the most easily accessible. They are pretty inexpensive. I recommend, if you are going to feed crickets, which I do suggest, buying them in bulk online. I use Premium Crickets. They do not sponsor me, but they should. It's a really great company here in Georgia, and I'll buy mine by like the 3,000, and they last me a good while. The only thing that you want to make sure is you have something that you keep them in, like a bin or whatever, with really good ventilation, because one of the things that seems to kill them off the most and make them stinky is if they get really hot and they sweat, because then it creates like a film, like a mucusy kind of film on the bottom, and they die off very quickly. So you want to make sure you have good ventilation. They're not kept in like a closet, and they're not in like direct sunlight to where they could get really hot. You just want to make sure they're kept in good conditions. I would say don't try breeding. I haven't had any success with it. It's very hard, and they have shorter lifespans, so they just tend to die very quickly. I don't know. I find buying them in the bulk seems to work out a lot better, and it's more cost effective. If you spend $10 at a pet store, you can get maybe like 10 dozen, 9 dozen crickets. But if you were to spend $10 at like Premium Crickets, you could get almost 1,000. So I just think it works out much better that way. I highly recommend it, and you can get them shipped directly to your house, which is awesome. So yeah, I don't know, I think that works really well. Their moisture is about 77%, protein is at 23%, fat is at 7%, fiber is at 2%, and their ash is also at 1%. Now, their calcium to phosphorus ratio is 1:9, so it's a little bit higher, which makes them not quite as spectacular as dubia roaches, but they are still a good staple food creature, so it's still going to be good to feed your reptiles. I definitely would say, as far as like the dubia roaches go, you could feed that to your reptile their entire life and they would do really well. However, it's just like us. Would you want to eat dubia roaches your whole life? Probably not. I like to add variety in with my reptiles, so I feed a lot of these different things, but dubia roaches and crickets do tend to be my top 2 feeders for my insects. So anyway, the next one I'm going to talk about is mealworms. Now, these are super controversial, as you probably know, in the reptile community. I would say as long as you stick with the smaller mealworms, you should be okay. They don't chew through your reptile's body. That is a myth. However, I would stay away from the giant ones. Those are given hormones to kind of make them big, and then I've heard they don't even pupate and go to the next stage, like they don't become beetles. I don't know if that's necessarily true, but I'm not willing to take that risk. I've heard too many bad things about the giant ones, and if you want to feed something bigger, just feed a superworm. But anyway, mealworms are much smaller. They're good for like baby leopard geckos, small amphibians, small reptiles, little baby bearded dragons, things like that, so they are a good option. The nice thing about these is you can keep them in the fridge. It makes them kind of slow down in their growth process, and they just kind of get put in a state of limbo, I guess you could say. And I don't know, they just live a long time. They can live a couple months that way. And I've also found that they're really easy to breed. You just throw them in a bin, give them food and grain, and they seem to do really well. I have had great success with breeding my own mealworms, and it's nice to have them on supply just in case I want to, give them to my reptiles as like a little treat here and there. And if you have something like a hedgehog, that would be a really good way to get lots and lots of mealworms. I would definitely recommend doing that. So their moisture is at 62%, protein is at 19%, fat is at 13%, fiber is at 3%, and ash is yet again at 1, and their calcium to phosphorus ratio is a 1:7. So not bad. Next I'm going to talk about superworms. These are larger than the mealworms. Like I said, don't do giant mealworms. I would do superworms if you want to do a worm. I like giving these to my bearded dragons on a rare occasion, or some of my other reptiles like my tokay. He seems to like them. I don't do it all the time just because, well, we'll get to that in a second. Anyway, so as long as you give them on occasion, that's really good. And they actually have less chitin in their exoskeleton than mealworms, so they're actually not as crunchy. They're a little bit easier to digest, which is really interesting to learn because you would think the opposite with them looking so hard and crunchy. My bearded dragon with MBD, metabolic bone disease, really likes them. They're a little bit easier for him to catch than like a cricket, and he still likes to feel like he can catch his food, so I like giving him those every once in a while. I think they're a good option, and just be sure if you do get them, don't refrigerate them. They will die. I couldn't tell you the complete science behind it, just don't refrigerate them. They'll die. As far as breeding goes, I think breeding them is very easy. The only thing you want to make sure is that you keep them in the little plastic ramekin cups with the lids all separate. Put one in each cup and then keep them in like a bin. And once you notice they kind of get into their little, I guess, cocoon-like state, just keep them in there. They will turn into beetles soon, and once they turn into beetles, you can put them in your collective beetle container or terrarium, whatever, and then they can start breeding. Just make sure you have some grains on the bottom for them to grow up in. Sanction those out over time. I think they're really super easy to breed. The only thing with them is mealworms, you just let them do their thing, whereas these, like I said, they seem to do the best if you put them all in separate little containers. I don't know, they just seem to do well that way. So their moisture is at 58%, protein is at 20%, fats are at 18%, fiber is at 3%, ash is also at 1%, and then here's the big reason why I don't think these should be your staple insect for feeding. Their calcium to phosphorus ratio is 1 to 18. Even if you coat these guys in calcium, which I do recommend doing with all of your reptiles, feeders, they would still just have so much phosphorus. It is just not good to feed your reptile that all of the time. I don't recommend it. And then moving right along, we have waxworms. These are super high in fat content, as you can probably tell by their little grub-like bodies. They're just really fat and squishy looking. These are really great to give your reptiles that might be sick or a little underweight, because this will really help them kind of get more energy and put on some weight. I wouldn't give these all the time. These are definitely more like a treat or as something to give your reptiles that aren't really eating, because they will get obese, and we don't want that, as I mentioned before. That is no bueno, so no obesity. It's also a really great thing to give any of your reptiles that may have just laid eggs or they have just bred, because they're going to be lower in energy and in fat, especially considering a lot of their nutrients went towards their eggs. So this is a good way to kind of build that back up inside of them. Also, these are another one that you can keep in the fridge. They probably don't last as long as a mealworm, I would say, but they will last a little bit longer if you do keep them in the fridge. So that is pretty cool as well. I have never tried breeding these, and I honestly don't see the point in trying, just because, like I mentioned, I rarely give these to my reptiles, only if they're sick or as like a treat. Every so often I'll go out and buy a cup and give some to everybody. But this isn't a staple by any means. This isn't like a primary feeding source, so I would say just get it once in a blue moon. Don't worry about breeding. Don't even try. Their moisture is 59%. Protein is at 14%, and the fat content is at 25%. The only other worm or feeder that is higher than that is a butterworm, and they're at, I believe, 27 or 28%. That is such high fat content, which could be great in some cases, but not all the time. Fiber is at 3%, ash is less than 1%. It seems to be the lowest so far that we've gone over. Their calcium to phosphorus ratio is 1 to 7, so pretty good. All right, next, and I appreciate you guys staying with me. This is a lot to go over. I'm sorry. I know it's a lot of information, but you need to be well informed. I'm bringing it all down as briefly as I can. Anyway, so hornworms. These are really great for dehydrated reptiles that you might have. You probably know a lot of reptiles don't always drink directly from a bowl. They often lick their plants or the glass or get that moisture from their food. Sometimes they'll drink, obviously, especially if you give them a bath. They seem to drink a lot then. But this is a really great way to give your reptile water if it's dehydrated. I find it's best to get them and then keep them warm. They grow very quickly that way, and then you can give your reptile one that's like super big and fat, like 2 inches long. I love giving them to my bearded dragons and my Meller's chameleon. They absolutely love them. It's a great treat. I would not give this to them all the time. I've never tried breeding. I've heard it's easy. Don't take my word for that, but I've heard it's pretty simple to do. like I said, I've never tried. I have had a couple of the moths from when they've gotten into a cocoon and then, you know, became a beautiful moth. But aside from that, I've never actually tried breeding them, so can't tell you how easy it is. I've heard it's easy though. So as far as their moisture goes, they're at 85%, so that is super high. That definitely is what most of their body consists of, is water. Their protein, however, is at 9%, so that is very low. I definitely not say make this an everyday feeder. This is going to be more of a treat slash give to your dehydrated animals. Alright, so fat is at 3%. Fiber, I don't have a percentage on. I'm going to assume it's little to none because they don't really have an exoskeleton. They're so soft and squishy, I just don't really think they have much of anything there. Ash is at 1%, and their ratio is 1 to 3, which is actually really good. So coat them with some calcium and they are going to be a great means of calcium. They're going to be a great means of getting some hydration in there. They're good. Alright, so next is fruit flies. This is one that you probably won't have to worry about too often unless you have smaller little reptiles or amphibians. This is really great for like young poison dart frogs or just young frogs in general, maybe an anole, or maybe once in a while a long-tailed lizard, but oftentimes you won't really need these. It's just for your little itty bitty babies that can't necessarily eat small crickets, unless you were to feed them pinheads, but I don't even waste my time with pinheads. They're expensive for like nothing, so I think fruit flies are easier. They can be a little stinky, mostly from the culture that you keep them in, because I will say I have bred them. They're super easy to breed. Their cultures are a little stinky though, because it's more of like a mash, and it just doesn't smell very good, especially over time. So that is one thing to keep in mind. However, as long as you have a culture, a lot of pet stores sell it, or you can make your own. That's what I did. It's pretty easy. You can look up a guide online. It's super easy to breed them, so you will pretty much never have to buy them if you just put in the little bit of work. Their moisture is at a 61%. Protein is at 18%, fat is at 14%, which is kind of crazy. You wouldn't really expect that with something so small. Fiber is at 3%, ash is at 4%, which is the highest ash content we've seen so far. And then their ratio is 1 to 5, so not terrible. And then lastly, we're going to talk about feeder mice. Now, you know, those are often fed to snakes or, you know, rats, mice, whatever, to snakes. But there are other reptiles that can eat them, like larger reptiles, such as monitors. And when they get really big, you gotta give them something a little bit bigger for them to sustain their lives. You know, it's just the way of life. You just gotta do it. I suggest doing frozen, thawing them out and heating them up to mimic like the body temperature of that mouse. I won't even tell you how to breed mice, just because I don't believe in it. It can harm your snakes. They could be carrying diseases that way. They could actually physically hurt or scratch your snake. I also just think it's really cruel. I keep mice and rats as pets, as you guys probably know if you've been watching me for a while, so I just don't believe in it. I'm not even going to tell you how to do it. I think it's super easy to just go out and buy frozen mice. They're not very expensive, especially if you get them from like a reptile feeder sort of place that does sell things and insects by the bulk. They often do mice and rats too, so not very expensive, not hard to find. I would definitely suggest doing that. It's just much safer and it's not as cruel in my personal opinion. I will sometimes give like my bearded dragon pinkies, the female that I have, Venus, just because when she lays a bunch of eggs, I can tell she's really tired. She looks a little skinnier, and I just think it's a really great way to kind of build up her protein and just give her a little bit more energy really quickly. So every once in a while when she lays a bunch of eggs, I'll give her a pinky. I think it's really nice and she seems to really appreciate it. So that's kind of when I will do that. But oftentimes for me and what I have, I only feed it to my snakes. But you do need to know that option is there for you if you have larger reptiles, and in fact, it is probably the best thing you can feed your larger reptiles. As far as their protein goes, I'm basing this off of an adult mouse. For little baby pinkies and fuzzies and hoppers and things like that, these numbers are going to be different, especially the pinkies. They have higher levels of like protein, lower fat, higher calcium, but anyway, you can look that up separately, but I'm going with just an adult mouse. So the protein is 64.2%, their fat is 17%, I didn't get anything on fiber, and the ash is 9.7%. Yet again, I don't have a ratio for you, I'm sorry, I'm so sorry. The calcium is very high. More high than what you would probably think, especially, like I said, in the pinkies and in the little babies. So anyway guys, that is all I have for you in this video. I hope you learned something today about feeder creatures for your reptiles. I've done a lot of research on this and I've been breeding my own feeders for a while now, ever since I've had reptiles, so I like to think I maybe know what I'm talking about, and I'm sorry if this doesn't sound as polished, or I don't know, this is my second time filming it. I'm sorry, I'm just a mess. I haven't been filming in so long, you can tell. I'm just a mess. Anyway, I will leave all of my social media handles down below in the description. Please be sure to follow me, leave a like, subscribe, and I will see you guys in my next video.